In this documentary, we will be talking about the Korean War's causes and its troublesome consequences. Please continue watching and you will learn about Korea's history, war, and divide.
The Korean War has been labeled as a police action against communism. It was a conflict of beliefs and leadership. It was a conflict between communist and non-communist, and so it was a police action because the United Nations wanted to stop communism from spreading. It could have been a simpler civil war, but because both sides were helped by external powers that were involved in the Cold War, it changed into a proxy war. A proxy war is a war that results when two powers use third parties as substitutes for fighting directly.
Throughout most of Korea's history, it has been invaded, influenced, and been fought over by its larger neighboring countries. The Japanese, Russian, and Chinese competed in armed conflict, and Japan dominated both countries, which established its dominance in Korea. The US made a deal with the Soviet Union to force out the Japanese, and so Japan lost control at the end of World War II. As part of the alliance, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel to make North Korea and South Korea. The Soviet Union governed North Korea, whereas the US governed South Korea. 2 years later, both the Soviet Union and United States left Korea by itself. But the Soviet Union had left behind a communist government and South Korea had democracy. These rival governments were established in 1948. However, both sides wanted to unify Korea under their own type of government. North Korea wanted unified Korea as communist, and South Korea wanted to bring democracy.
Because of failed elections to unify Korea, there was political frustration, which increased in intensity to warfare. After North Korea invaded South Korea and attacked using guerrilla warfare, these negotiations stopped. The UN and US intervened and managed to repel the North Koreans past the 38th parallel. After that, the People's Republic of China came to the aid of North Korea. After China came to help North Korea, the fighting eventually ceased with an army strike that brought back the border at the 38th parallel. The demilitarized zone, a 2.5-mile neutral area, was created. The North Korean attack on South Korea was the trigger event of the war. It was an attempt of unifying Korea using guerrilla warfare. The divide of Korea was a major cause of the war, because if it never were divided, there wouldn't have been any tension between the two Koreas.
The political frustration and tension was one long-term cause of the war. This tension of inability to unify Korea because of different governments escalated to warfare.
Communism was another long-term cause of the forgotten war, because all the neighboring countries of Korea were communist, and so it was expected that Korea would be turned into a communist country too. However, the US and UN didn't want this because a smaller country would have been scared to try and repel a threat from a stronger communist country, as Harry Truman said.
If communists were permitted to force their way into the Republic of Korea without opposition from the free world, no small nation would have the courage to resist threats and aggression by a stronger communist neighbor. Yo!
Because the UN and US interfered, the war became a bigger deal and it became a proxy war. Communism also links into another long-term cause, the Cold War. The US and USSR were enemies after the Cold War because the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism, whereas the US wanted to stop it.
How did the communist leaders treat the civilians? Did they treat your family well or badly?
여기 왔을 때는 여기에서 반동분자라서 우익분자들을 붙들어다가 그 당시에는 그 군인을 끌고 갔다고 그래가지고 강제로 인민군에다가 편입시켜가지고 전투에다가 막 저걸 했어. 그래서 할아버지도 그거 끌려갈 뻔하다가 그냥 도망가가지고 고향으로 간 다음에 그걸.
Thank you, Mr. Lee, for sharing that information with us. We hope to see you again. There were several casualties on both sides, though the exact figure may never be known. The Korean War created more friction between the United States and the Soviet Union. The war demonstrated the will of the United States to do everything possible to prevent the proliferation of communism. A feeling of enmity developed between China and the United States that would last for decades. Families were split with relatives on either sides of the border. This war created a fear in the United States of the domino effects of communism. The United States intervened in Vietnam to avoid another North Korea. South Korea became an important U.S. military base with thousands of American troops stationed there. The Korean War never ended. The inability of the two sides to resolve their differences has meant that the two Koreas and their allies have had to remain on battle-ready state along the border ever since.
The Korean War was quite similar to certain wars, for example, the Chinese Civil War and the Vietnam War. The Chinese Civil War was between the Chinese Nationalist Party and the Communist Party of China. For 10 years, the two parties fought against each other. Even when the Japanese attacked China, the Nationalists and Communists officially made an alliance, but still they fought. The Communists had skilled fighters, but their forces were small. The Soviet Union was helping the Communists, and they were much stronger than the Nationalists. On the other hand, the Nationalists had massive political, financial, and military aid from the U.S. The U.S. had a plan to split the country into two, but that plan failed and the fighting continued. The Nationalists were no match for the Communists, and the Communists won, creating the People's Republic of China.
This war is very similar to the Korean War because it was a war of a communist government against a nationalist government. The Chinese parties also had the same supporters, the Soviet Union and the USA. However, the Chinese Civil War didn't escalate to a proxy war because the Soviet Union and the USA weren't fighting each other, but helping each side. The Vietnam War was also a Cold War military conflict about communism. The war was fought between the communist North Vietnam, who were supported by communist allies, and the government of South Vietnam and their anti-communist allies, such as the US. The US entered the war to try to stop the spread of communism in South Vietnam, like they did with the Korean War.
Today, South Korea has become a major economic and technological power. North Korea is a poverty-stricken, heavily militarized nation. It is hoped that one day the two Koreas will become one. On October 4, 2007, the South Korean leader Roh Moo-hyung and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-il signed an 8-point peace agreement on issues of permanent peace, economic cooperation, high-level talks, renewal of highway, air travel, and train services. North Korea has carried out a controversial nuclear test and several ballistic missile tests. Nuclear North Korea is a threat to both Japan and